Okay, great. A few introductory notes. The source sheet is going in the chat. I put it in a couple of times, and MJL, My Jewish Learning, does send around a source sheet, a PDF after class. So just look out for that over the next few days, and you will have access to a document that you can reference. A few other notes. Mara mentioned my website. You're welcome to also email me afterwards if you don't get to share a thought or ask a question. My email is abby@explorejewish.com. And I will do my very best to get back to you as soon as possible. And if you want to be on my email list, I send a weekly email about learning opportunities. I teach a weekly Torah portion class, so you're certainly welcome to come to that. As we go through the text together today, I generally don't see the chat. I have it open right now. I guess as an experiment, I might leave it open, but it can be distracting. I really like to look at your faces and look at the text. And as some of you know, I have a second monitor kind of behind me. So I'm looking at you and then I'm looking up at the text. So that's what you'll see me do. And I think that's it for introductory notes. As I'll share my screen also, and I'll pause in between kind of texts or sections of text so that we can hear from some of you and hear your comments and questions. I also want to wish everyone a Chodesh Tov, a good month. Today is Rosh Chodesh. It's the last day of the month of Shvat, and tomorrow is the first day of the first month of Adar. It's a leap year, so there are 2 Adar months. Purim is in the second one, so everything feels late this year. And I hope it's a month with more peace and good news coming our way. So with all that, we'll get started with some of the ideas that I think are related to what's going on around us today. I want to share with you that first, we'll look at an outline of what's in Parashat Mishpatim, which is in the academic world known as the Covenant Code, the one section of several of biblical law that comes after the 10 Commandments. A lot of detail. We are going to look at some, I think, key concepts. There are no hard and fast rules that I'm going to suggest today, but I am going to hopefully allow us all to engage with some ideas that help us think about right and wrong, but I certainly don't have clear-cut answers about how these laws apply today. So I'll leave that to you to think thoughtfully and carefully about. So I will go ahead and share my screen now. This is a doc you don't have. It's an outline of the Parsha. So let me go ahead and share that just so we can, oops. Mara, do you mind letting me share my screen? Let's see if I can do that. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, I will make this bigger, and I'm adjusting now so I can see you also. Okay. So there are a few different subjects in Parashat Mishpatim. You can see there's a lot in section 2. Let's hone in there. There's a lot here that are both ethical dictates and religious dictates, things you may be familiar with from other studies, like concern for the stranger, the sabbatical year, Shabbat, the idea of not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk, which in the hundreds of years later translates to the separation of meat and dairy. Loans, first fruits, lots of different kinds of laws here. What we'll do today is I want us to think together about an eye for an eye as it's, I hope I pronounced this correctly, as it's in the Latin, lex talionis. And I also want us to think about the law of kindness toward the stranger. Perhaps we have a juxtaposition in our Torah portion, or perhaps we just have several concepts that we are instructed to hold at the same time to help us make decisions about how we behave in the world. So here's our main Torah portion sheet. And I want us to be thinking about different interpretations, what we think an eye for an eye means. We'll learn from some of our classical commentaries. We'll take a look at a modern commentary. And then also we'll look at the verse, a key verse from this week's Torah portion about kindness to the stranger, and a commentary from Rabbi Shai Held. And we'll try and put all of that together. So let's start off with a difficult text, Exodus 21, verses 23 to 25. And I'll go ahead and read this text in Hebrew, and then we'll pause to just for a moment, take a couple of comments or questions about what you think this means, and then we'll go ahead and I'll share a couple of ideas and we'll look at commentaries. So in English with the Hebrew, for those of you who want to take a look at the Hebrew on your right, when two people fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husbands may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. I'll explain this in another moment and then hear from you, of course. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Not a fun text to read. So here's the scenario. Two people are fighting. There's a pregnant woman who's in the vicinity. She has a miscarriage. The baby dies as a result of the fetus dies or no longer is alive as a result of the fight. But she's not injured. She's not hurt in any way. The person who, the assaulter, the attacker, has to be fined a monetary fine according to what the husband thinks is appropriate. And the compensation is based on what he thinks is appropriate. But if she dies, that's the implication here, perhaps if she's injured, but it does seem to be implying death, then the Torah says life for life. So it seems like at first glance, the implication is that the assaulter, the person who commits, who's responsible for her death, that person has to be killed. And then we seem in verse 24 to go back to damages, not necessarily life. So if literally it seems, and you can hear I'm really emphasizing it seems, if an eye is hurt, something has to happen to the assaulter's eye, and then all the other body parts are mentioned. So I hope you didn't read too much further in this source sheet, but I do want to hear from you, even if you did, if you're reading this, and well, let me just say, if you're reading this, what is your sense of the damages that are described here? Is an eye for an eye literal, or is it not literal? Does it mean something else? So I see two hands already. So we'll take those. I see two. I'm just going to go with two for now. I apologize. I saw Gal and Ross first. So briefly, Gal and Ross, can you share what you think this could mean? And then I'll begin to explore a little bit more. And then Paul, I hope you'll get a chance to share in a little bit.
Thank you. What if the damage is emotional? I'm thinking the mother and the grandparents.
Yeah. Okay. So Gal, I'm going to ask you, you tell me, what if the damage is emotional based on these verses? What would you say? How would you rule?
Some compensation needs to be made, but that's all.
Yeah, that's what I would say also, because in verses 24 and 25, it seems like the idea is that fair punishment or just punishment or consequence should take place. And if there's emotional damages, I think we could interpret verses 24 and 25 to mean, in fact, that compensation, fair and just compensation for emotional harm should also take place. Okay, Ross, and then I'll just remind everyone, we'll come back, hopefully, to those who have their hands raised at the moment. So Ross, go ahead.
Thank you for this. Yeah, I think we have to stop on the literal and consider that at first, since the words were picked for a normative, grammatical, historical meaning at the time, right? And number two, I'd argue that the land into which they were going to be living, Canaan, was a lawless, decadent, perverted place where you could chop someone's head off just for an offense. So this was indeed, under God's justice, a limit to what can happen for God people to live by, because this was a huge step up from the times of the day.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ross. So that's what I want to share with everyone, is that it does seem like at first glance, I think this text can be a little bit troubling. You know, we look at it and we say, sounds so harsh, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And we do know in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, capital punishment for intentional murder, not for accidental murder, but in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, intentional murder is something that someone pays the price for by capital punishment. We're not going to talk about that in depth today. But it does seem like here, for damages, for physical damages, or let's say emotional damages that Gail mentioned, it does seem like there's a limit, actually. Although it seems like this is dictating something that could happen in a harsh way, we have to make sure that someone pays the price. Actually, as Ross said, this does seem to, as scholars think, limit the damages that could take place. In other words, in the ancient Near East, other law codes, and also it does seem like it was possible that people could take vengeance on any kind of damage. And here the Torah wants us to be thinking about fairness and justice, not in terms of vengeance, but in terms of a limit to what's possible as a consequence. So I want to just show you, first, we're actually going to scroll down, and I want to show you a modern commentary that really says this succinctly, and I think it'll be interesting to all of us. So I'm going to go ahead and read this, and then we'll read some classical commentaries and talk a little further. So other Near Eastern societies permitted the family of a murderer, so now we're talking about murder, to accept a monetary settlement from the murderer, but the Torah forbids that. The guilt of a murderer is infinite because the murdered life is invaluable. Okay, so right now, and this is quoting a scholar named Moshe Greenberg, we're talking about when the verses are referring to murder and other verses where capital punishment is appropriate, according to the Torah. By contrast, the Torah never requires the death penalty for crimes against property. In biblical law, and I'll comment a little bit more on this in a second, in biblical law, life and property are incommensurable. Taking of a life cannot be made up for by any amount of property, nor can any property offense be considered as amounting to the value of life. In all likelihood, an eye for an eye is a graphic way of expressing the abstract idea that the punishment should not be too lenient or too harsh, but should fit the crime and the circumstances. So in this short passage where I quoted a couple of things here, and you saw me put in ellipses in, because Moshe Greenberg, as quoted in the wonderful Eitz Chaim Chumash, which is used generally in conservative synagogues around the world, an excellent Chumash, Hebrew Bible with a commentary. Moshe Greenberg summarizes beautifully that in the Hebrew Bible, generally speaking, murder, because of the sacredness that is attributed to life, murder is, the consequence of murder is murder, which certainly, again, can be debated if that is, in fact, a way to express the sacredness of life. But let's just talk about what's in the Torah for now. And then damage to a person or property is in a whole other category, and vengeance outside the bounds of what's appropriate should not happen. And so the Torah, in this graphic but perhaps poetic way, says that when there has to be a consequence for damage to a person or to property, it has to be fair and appropriate. In other words, not too much. Like, there are other sources that say that the wealthy individuals would sort of provide an over-the-top kind of response, whereas a poor person, someone who did not have the same kind of resources, would not be able to do that. And so the idea here is really fairness and justice, strict fairness. So I want to pause here before we read some of Rashi, a well-known classical commentator, and I'll mention just a teeny bit about who he is for those who have never heard of him. So let's pause here. I'm curious if you think Moshe Greenberg's assessment of the Torah sounds accurate based on your knowledge, and also if you think the Torah's approach seems fair. So I see a couple of hands raised, and I want to make sure I'm going to invite responses specific to this assessment here, and if you think the Torah approach is fair or just. So I did see, I want to call on Paul and Andrea. Those are the first two. I'm sorry, Paul and Brian. Those were the first two responses that I saw earlier. And so Paul and then Brian.
Thank you, Rabbi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, no, great, thank you. Yeah,
Thank
I totally agree that, you know, I'm not taking it literal, and I think Ross nailed it before, that, you know, just given the way you know, the world was at that time, that, you know, here in the Torah we're given an opportunity to make things, you know, fair and just. So I think, you know, all the, you know, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth was just basically just being explicit and saying that, you know, the crime has to, you know, the punishment has to fit the crime.
Right.
Yeah. And as for the murdered life is invaluable. Yeah, I am aligned with that as well.
Okay.
We are all, you know, unique individuals, irreplaceable. And so I agree with what's written in this commentary.
Great. Thank you so
Rabbi.
much. Thank you so much, Paul. Okay, Brian, go ahead. Oh, Brian, so go ahead. Hold on. I'll ask you to unmute.
Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted. Now we can hear you.
Okay. I'm sort of like, my vantage point is the way in which it was laid out. I don't think it was figurative. I think that because of the fact of the way society was then, in order for the Lord to have stopping of the wickedness, it was extremely severe. Why? Well, because I don't want to get into a fight with somebody if this could be the results, or I don't want to engage in this kind of conduct if I'm going to lose my eye or have my arm or, you know, taken off. And I think that's the starting point, and that's where, you know, when I look at it, it needed to be too harsh. But as people start submitting, because that's what basically our life is submitting to the will of God. As we start to correct our behaviors, and as a society, well, then the punishments then can sort of be I don't want to say reduced, but seem to be more less harsh.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, much less
Okay,
harsh,
great.
so that you can then go to the lower road. So not everything is punishable by death, or not everything.
Okay.
But yeah, that's how it, you know, in terms of I look. So in one sense, I do agree.
Brian,
with it,
I'm going to ask you to wrap up just so we can keep
Okay.
moving and hear from others too.
Yes. Okay. No,
Okay,
I'm finished.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, great. So I want to mention that indeed, you know, some scholars like Everett Fox say, you know, we don't know for sure. We don't know it was this literal, but generally, for the most part, scholars think it was not. But of course, Brian, as you said, we just cannot know for sure. So your sense that perhaps this was literal and used as a deterrent may not be wrong. We don't know. So thank you for bringing that into the mix. I want us to have the opportunity. I know there are a few hands up, so hopefully we'll come to you a little bit later. And I'll ask you to lower them for right now. So thank you for your desire to participate. I want us to read some classical Jewish sources, meaning early medieval sources, to see how at least Rashi, but he is quoting other earlier rabbinic sources, how he represents, how Rashi approaches these difficult verses. So the first verse that I want us to look at is from verse 24. Actually, let me just make sure I quoted this correctly. It was 23, I apologize. So the verse that says life for life. And Rashi quotes first that part of the verse. If harm should occur, then you are to give life for life in place of life. Our rabbis differ as to the explanation of the word nefesh the first time it occurs here, meaning the focus here is what does it mean a life for a life? Meaning the second life is the person that unfortunately was killed. And the first mention of life here in the phrase means the price, refers to the price that has to be paid, the person that seemingly should be murdered. So our rabbis differ as to the explanation of the life. There are some who say that it actually signifies life, meaning actual in Hebrew, for those Hebrew readers, nefesh mamash. Some of you might have heard the word mamash. Really, actually, it's a modern Hebrew word as well. Others say that it means monetary compensation, mamon in Hebrew, but not literally life. Avalo nefesh mamash, not literally life. So Rashi already even is shifting away, at least in this commentary. We're not focused at the moment on physical damages that may occur to a person, but we're also, let's talk about here today, going back to a life for life. And what I want to share with you is that the rabbis even limit this. There's a sense of, in the pshat, in what seems like the most likely contextual meaning of the verses 24 and 25, that there's a limit, that this isn't necessarily literal, it's figurative for when someone or something is damaged. We have to compensate fairly, limiting our desire for vengeance. The same is true even if there's accidental murder, that the person does not get, there is no capital punishment for accidental murder. Many rabbis say, Rashi quotes, that it's actually not literal life, but figurative monetary or actual monetary compensation as being described in what seems like or initially sounds like something literal. So I mentioned earlier, you might have heard me say that not only does the Torah say that intentional murder is deserving of capital punishment, but the implication of that is that accidental murder is not. And in fact, in other places in the Torah, we read of what's called in Hebrew an ir miklat, a shelter city. And if someone is killed, I should say, accidentally, the person who accidentally kills gets to go to a shelter city so that the family, the loved ones, cannot take unnecessary and out of bounds revenge on that person. And so when we read here, life for life, we're actually reading that in the context of accidental killing. The person did not intend to kill the woman. And in other verses in the Torah, the description of an accidental killing also results in limiting the consequences outside, so that they don't include revenge that is over the top. So the verses that the rabbis, the part of the verses here that the rabbis understand to be limiting the consequences of an accidental killing fit with other verses in the Torah that also describe the consequences of accidental killing. We're going to read one more Rashi, and then I'm going to pause. So an eye for an eye. Rashi says, and I didn't mention before, Rashi died in 1105 in France. He was one of the first of many early medieval commentators, but he's considered really he's really one of the most famous because he wrote a copious commentary on most verses in the Hebrew Bible and many parts of the Talmud, the early rabbinic text. And he's considered someone who made the texts more accessible for many people. So he writes here, an eye for an eye. If one blinded the eye of his fellow man, he has to pay him the value of an eye, i.e., he pays him how much value his value would be diminished if he were to be sold as a slave in the market. Now that part is a little disturbing, so I'll comment on that in a moment. In the same way, all other cases are to be dealt with, but it's in the same way that all other cases are to be dealt with. But it does not mean the actual cutting off of the offender's limb, just as our rabbis have explained in the Talmud, in the earlier Talmudic text about 500 years earlier. So first, Rashi is saying, what does eye for an eye mean, and how do we determine the non-literal monetary compensation? So this, in the Hebrew Bible and in some of the subsequent rabbinic texts, slavery was an institution that was accepted, not the same kind of slavery that we read about for the Israelites in Egypt. In other words, there's guidance in the Torah for what at the time of the Torah was considered acceptable slavery. I'll just say, certainly when I read about slavery in the Hebrew Bible, I don't like it, but I do the way that I deal with that is I just say, these are very old texts and we don't have to take everything literally. And there is an effort to limit and to make appropriate the treatment of slaves. So without going into detail on that subject right now, Rashi is just trying to understand. He certainly takes eye for an eye, not literally, and says, okay, how do we determine the value? And this is not actually literal based on our earlier rabbinic teachers. It does not mean the actual cutting off of an offender's limb. So both in the classical interpretive sources, we have this limiting and this non-literal understanding of our verses. And then in more modern times, scholars do think, generally speaking, that this is metaphorical and these verses are of a limiting nature. So I want to pause here specifically on, and see if there are any questions or reflections on Rashi's limiting approach, both life for life and also eye for an eye. And then we'll try and get in a couple more texts before we wrap up for today. So the hands that I saw first, Andrea and Ellen, I saw your hands earlier, so I want to invite you to share. And Margot, I hope we'll be able to get to you also. So thank you for raising your hand. Okay, I don't remember who was first. So Ellen, I'll ask you to share briefly, and then Andrea, I'll ask you to share briefly as well. So Ellen.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
So, I'm thinking about this in terms of the modern concept of restorative justice.
Yeah.
And when I think of some of these things, where they talk about the money and things like that, I think it would be maybe ancient restorative justice on some level.
Right.
But once again, as you were saying, if one is of means, then it means nothing to, give a few shekels or gold coins or whatever. But, I go back to, like, let's say if some man kills a woman's husband, she's a widow. And in those days, her life would have been made much harder than our current time. Mm-hmm. Imagining something like, the man has to toil and labor. So it's the efforts of his life for the life that he took away. It doesn't say a death for a death. It says a life for a life. So I guess how I'm kind of starting to think of that is the things that one does in one's life. And so, you know, our modern non-justice system is based on so many poorly understood aspects of this biblical stuff. And I guess I just want to be in a place where I'm personally thinking of it that way. I mean, you know, we also understand today that some people are so profoundly mentally ill that their sense of killing, not killing, justice, it is so skewed that they have to be kept away from the rest of humanity because of the harm they would cause. So those are just some of the thoughts I'm thinking about.
Great. Beautiful. Okay. So I want to respond to what you said, Ellen, and share a little bit more expansively. So first, I do want to clarify, and you may know this already, Ellen, the situation that we're presented with here is that the woman dies rather than the husband dies. But your scenario, I think also, if we are thinking about life for life, we can certainly think about it in the scenario that you mentioned too. And I think sometimes people here have heard me talk about the distinction between, I mentioned the word earlier, pshat and drash. So what we can read out from the text, what is contextual. Sometimes pshat is translated as a simple meaning. It's not really what it means. It means really what's in the text there that we can pull out, that we can actually support based on either historical context or literary context. And then there's drash. And Jews have been doing drash since, even in the Torah, there are interpretations on other verses in the Hebrew Bible. And I think, Ellen, what I heard you say is this, one way to drash on, as the expression goes, life for life, is that when we behave in a way that harms someone else and there are pretty serious consequences, we have to ask ourselves, well, what can we do in our own lives to make up for our actions? A life for a life actually means, how do we spend our lives? What actions do we do on a day-to-day basis in our lives that will somehow attempt to compensate for our harm? So Ellen, I hope that, does that kind of expand on and build on? Did I hear what you were saying correctly? Okay. Okay. Ellen, if you want to unmute in a moment and respond to that, that's great. And if not, that's fine too. But I hope that does expand a little bit on what Ellen said for everyone. And I think it's a beautiful interpretation of life for life. Okay, Andrea. Andrea Shapiro, if you want to go ahead and unmute. You can't unmute. Let's see.
Okay, now I can.
Okay, great.
Before I get to my point, I want to say that I thought Ellen's point was amazing.
Yeah, very good.
The idea that this could be making space for restorative justice, the value of a life, the value of what's lost, I think it's really great.
Beautiful, thank you.
But I have a different idea.
Okay.
About why you should, about the literalness of this.
Okay.
The Torah is unquestionably, I think, the most enduring and probably the most widely read book ever. And to imagine that it's limited to being literal is insulting to the Torah. The cadence of this, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, has a poetic cadence. It's not an exhaustive list. It doesn't say a finger for a finger. It doesn't say an ear for an ear. It's not meant to be instructive. Okay? It's meant to be a metaphor. And the authors of the most enduring book ever, no matter who you think wrote it, knew how to use metaphor. And this is meant to be a metaphor. It's meant to demonstrate the idea that don't go overboard with punishment and don't be too lenient. Let the punishment suit the crime.
Yeah. Okay. Beautiful. Andrea, thank you. I appreciate what you're adding here about sort of the enduring nature of the Torah and taking this part and other parts also as poetry and metaphor. So thank you so much, Andrea. Really appreciate your bringing that in. Okay, I actually want to add one more piece here. And then I hope there will be time for some other comments. And if not, I'll certainly invite you to shoot me an email, abby@explorejewish.com. So I want to just point out here that, we're talking about justice, fairness, and I think those are the questions that really Parashat Mishpatim, the Torah portion of Mishpatim laws, asks us to think about. We can't take everything literally, everything that was written here 2,500 years ago or more, but we can ask ourselves the same questions that these verses, I think, are asking us to think about. What does fairness look like? What does justice look like? But I want to present kind of a threefold essential concept model of this Torah portion, because in the Torah portion, there's also the oft repeated dictate that a ger, a stranger, a sojourner, a resident alien should not be oppressed, because the Israelites know what it's like to be oppressed as someone other, someone different. And so the Israelites received the commandment not to do the same to other people. So I want to read what Rabbi Shai Held wrote here and think about how this fits in with justice and fairness. I think not an easy question, and certainly not easy answers. This prohibition of treating a sojourner without any oppression whatsoever, this prohibition is so often cited that it's easy to miss just how radical and non-obvious it is. The Torah could have responded quite differently to the experience of oppression in Egypt. It could have said, since you were tyrannized and exploited and no one did anything to help you, you don't owe anything to anyone. How dare anyone ask anything of you? But it chooses the opposite path. Since you were exploited and oppressed, you must never be among the exploiters and degraders. You must remember what it feels like to be a stranger. Empathy must animate and intensify your commitment to the dignity and well-being of the weak and the vulnerable. And God holds you accountable. Religious obligation holds you accountable to this obligation. So a powerful text in our Torah portion when we're talking about justice and fairness, an eye for an eye, it's very strong language. And I am curious to hear, in connection to what we've been talking about so far, how you think empathy fits with fairness and justice. Do you see a contradiction? Do you see a complement to fairness and justice? So I want to take one or two questions. I did see there was a person before who had her hands raised for a while. So I want to give that person, I don't remember her name.
I think that was Margot.
Margot, thank you. Yeah, Margot, I want to invite you, if you have a response, a reflection in connection to empathy and its connection, I want to invite to the fairness and justice, what we've been talking about so far. I want to invite you to share. And if not, that's okay, of course. Okay.
I'm going hi, it's Margot here. I'm going to pass on this particular thing and invite the next person, but thank you for remembering me.
Sure. Okay, great. Jack, I'll go ahead, I believe, and ask you to weigh in here. You can go ahead and unmute. Should be able to do that.
It won't, I think there, can you hear me?
You're unmuted, yeah, you're unmuted now.
In looking at this, I find it really interesting in that we're interpreting this at our time, okay, in the 21st century. What did the people who originally, I know you can't answer it, but did they evaluate it the same way? Does that sound like a foolish question?
No, I don't think it's a foolish question at all. I mean, I think the prophets definitely reprimanded the people for not treating the widow, the orphan, and the stranger with enough dignity and respect. You may recall if the Yom Kippur Haftorah, one of the Yom Kippur Torah readings says from Isaiah, do you think I want your sacrifices, your fasts? I don't want any of that. I want you, in God's voice, to be treating the most vulnerable in the best ways possible. So I think this is something that ancient Israelites, and certainly others, struggled with and needed to hear from religious teachers, spiritual guides, constantly. You know, we don't know the extent to which the biblical law codes, like what we refer to as the covenant code here in Exodus, Parashat Mishpatim, we don't know if those were actually laws that people lived by. So I think the best we can do today, at least right now, the best I can advise humbly, very humbly today is say, okay, well, what do we do with all these teachings? What do we do with the sense of justice that the Torah wants us to carry out, limiting vengeance? What do we do with the fairness? How do we ask ourselves in our own lives what's fair on an individual basis when someone wrongs us? How do we vote in lawmakers that we think will enact justice and fairness and empathy? And these things these three things I think we all have to struggle with in our own ways. How do we balance those on an individual level and on a communal level? I really, maybe I should have started even more at the very beginning saying, I really don't have specific answers for this, but I think the Torah here is asking us to think hard about how to balance these things. And really humbly, I wish I had like more guidance, but humbly, that's the best that I can offer today. That really, these are key concepts: fairness, justice, empathy, that may be in contradiction with each other. And they're all right here in this biblical section referred to as the covenant code that we have to struggle with. So I'll invite you to think about that. And we do need to wrap up. It's 11:14, so I want to end on time, but I'll certainly invite you to go ahead and email me if you didn't get a chance to share. And I really just, at this difficult time, I invite us to be thinking as carefully and thoughtfully as possible about fairness and justice and empathy. And I'll wish you thoughtful reflections and questions and peace, a peaceful Shabbat and a peaceful month of Adar ahead. So Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Amen. Thank you, Abby, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.